Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to start out by inviting you just to throw out a few ideas, and what I want to just ask you is, what are you most concerned about? Obviously, climate must be one of those, or you wouldn't be here. Something connected to militarism. But what else? What are some of the other things that you are really concerned about right now? Yeah, just throw real quickly.
I'm concerned about what's happened in Nicaragua and Nathaniel.
Okay, the situation in Nicaragua, yeah.
And in Gaza.
And in Gaza, yep. What else?
Violence begetting violence.
Violence begetting violence, that spiral of violence.
Military budget.
The military budget.
Situation in Guatemala.
Yeah, situation in Guatemala.
Gun violence.
Gun violence, Ukraine. Anything closer to, well, also close to home? Governance, elections. There's a lot on our plate and a lot on our minds. And I want to talk about some of those things. And if there'll be some things, obviously, I won't get to that you may want to talk about. So we'll have time for questions, and I'll try to answer them. I wanted to start out by acknowledging that I grew up in a very conservative suburb. At the time, it was an all-white suburb, Coon Rapids, Minnesota. And I graduated from high school in 1969. And by every possible measure of social consciousness and political awareness, I did really poorly. And that was part me. I was living my life largely for athletics until I had my left leg ripped out of its hip socket in a football game, and it landed over my right shoulder. It stayed there, and I was told I may never walk again. That got my attention, and I started paying attention to things beyond. And by the way, I'm kind of a medical miracle because I was able to walk again and functioned really well for 50 years until I had a hip replacement last year, which has been wonderful, actually. Anyway, I pretty much missed the civil rights movement, the war in Indochina. And again, that wasn't all my fault. I grew up in a church that didn't talk about those things. I didn't even have one teacher all the way through high school that asked us to talk about things like civil rights in the Vietnam War. So college for me was an incredibly transformative time. And I want you to think about how important context is for the ideas that you hold today, because I'm guessing many of you would have stories somewhat similar to mine. College was a very big deal. First of all, because it was occurring, I went to college 1969 to 73 at St. Olaf, and even at a place like St. Olaf that you don't associate with a bastion of radicalism, we were taking the war pretty seriously. And all of us men at least, we had numbers. Mine happened to be 75. I didn't have to worry about it for myself because having that hip injury made me ineligible to be drafted. But that didn't mean that I wasn't concerned about other people with low numbers and other people who were likely to be drafted or already would have been. So we were paying attention to the war, and we started to hear a little bit more about the secret wars in Cambodia and Laos and other places, even before the internet. So that certainly got my attention. And then I took advantage of getting off campus. So I studied abroad, and one of our stops was Ethiopia. I thought that the people would be happy to see me because the U.S. was backing the government there. And it turned out wherever we went and people found out that our student group, that we were from the United States, we were pelted with stones. We were supposed to go to India for a month as part of this international study, and the Indian government refused to let us enter because the U.S. was backing a repressive dictator in Pakistan, and those two countries were feuding. In India, I got there on an individual visa, and I have to tell you, I was just overwhelmed by the poverty, overwhelmed by the hunger, overwhelmed by the massive inequality, to the point where I let so much pain of the world enter that it just about did me in. It was a very transformative but very difficult time. And I had read the book in college The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And so that had gotten my attention, and here I am in Calcutta and Bombay and other places. But the main point I took from that book was not just about population. It was a warning about the fact that human beings could alter the Earth to a point where we had exceeded the Earth's carrying capacity, which is still. So I started to think about environmental issues, and now we're talking about climate change, of course. And the other thing I mentioned in an op-ed piece I had in the Trib is our group arrived in Israel shortly after the so-called Munich massacre, where the Israeli athletes had been killed in Germany. And I was being taught folk songs by our guide. At the same time, they were interrupted by bombs going off and the explosions in the refugee camps. And those were U.S. planes. There were Israeli pilots, but those were U.S. planes. So all these things, you're talking about someone who, again, was oblivious and now is starting to awaken through some of these experiences to ask different questions and to look at the world and my role in it differently. So, as an undergraduate, I also then did a semester in inner city Chicago, which you couldn't get further away from Coon Rapids, Minnesota at the time in inner city Chicago. So that was quite the experience too. And it had me thinking a lot about the costs of war, the opportunity costs, because we were prioritizing war so much. And these kids that I dealt with, and I went back there and taught for a while after I graduated from St. Olaf. It was sobering to see the gap between their life experience and life possibility and ours, or mine, or many other people. So these were all very transformative, and maybe I'll just say in passing here, you can understand why a segment of the Republican Party, a big segment, doesn't want education in this kind of way, because it can be transformative. And I always remind myself, if I start to feel down about the human condition or our national condition, that if I was capable of change, then anyone is capable of change. And if I could have been so blinded by the context in which I grew, well, there's probably a lot of other people in that situation too. And somehow we have to find a way to intersect our lives and theirs. So as a result of that education and many other similar kinds of experiences of going on and living and working in Central America when the U.S. was sponsoring repressive governments throughout the region, to meeting and being inspired by the priests in Nicaragua that ran the Catholic University who were later murdered by graduates of a U.S. military training school. I could go on with my own story, but at this point I just want to highlight that as a result of that education, the context, and the experiences pretty much shaped the rest of my life, the last 50 years of my life, that have really focused, I think, on kind of four interconnected issues. And certainly war, peace, and U.S. foreign policy, that would be one, and inequality. Environmental justice, and the whole question of what it means to live in a sustainable way and to pursue economies that would actually be sustainable, meaning we're not destroying the earth in order to maintain our lifestyles at the present. So that was another one. Yeah, so I'll just stop there. So those were certainly two, and they're very, very interconnected. And I just want to highlight a couple of quotes that for me, I discovered these quotes later, but they made a lot of sense in light of what I'm describing for you as my own transformative experiences. And the first is quotes that I discovered later that were uttered earlier, I should have known this, by Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, for example, he warned that America, quote, would never invest the necessary funds to end poverty so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. Wow. Or he called the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He also noted that we needed a radical revolution of values and that a nation that, quote, continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. If I were to rewrite that quote today, I would say the nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military power projection than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And then, for those who might want to dismiss Martin Luther King Jr., we can go to what used to be kind of a favorite Republican, President Eisenhower, who said, and many of you are familiar with these, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of the children. This is not a way of life at all. In any true sense, under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And today we might want to reread that last sentence and say, under the cloud of climate change and global warming, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. And of course, he went on later in his farewell address to talk about, and name it directly, the power of the military-industrial complex to distort. And interestingly, when he talked about the distortion, certainly it was a distortion of priorities, it was a distortion of the economy, it was a distortion of the meaning of security. He said it was also capable of distorting our spirituality. I think I'm going to come back to that point in a minute because it actually is one of the central things that I want to challenge us with today is thinking about militarism as a belief system. All right. Shifting gears just a little bit, it was mentioned that I stumbled into teaching at the University of St. Thomas. I knew nothing about the University of St. Thomas, and a progressive priest there called me out of the blue and said that they were starting a Justice and Peace Studies department or program, and he wanted to know if I would come and teach a course. Well, I ended up being there for 25 years, in part because I liked his integrity. I was told by many people he was a person of great integrity, and I loved the idea of rooting education in a kind of liberation pedagogy that said that education was about, the goal of education is about not just knowledge, but about transformation, and about encouraging us to experience injustice, to identify the causes of injustice, to envision alternative futures, and then to act in all areas of our life to make those changes possible. That was at the heart of every course that we offered in our major in Justice and Peace Studies, which is what, for me, made teaching there possible and made it exciting and very, very worthwhile. But within the discipline of peace studies, I want to just point out a way that we oftentimes taught about peace. This would be wider than our St. Thomas discipline that really rooted justice, but it's pretty similar. And when we talk about peace in the discipline of peace studies, oftentimes we talk about it in two ways. And the first is referred to as negative peace. It's not really negative, it's just limited. And by negative peace, what was meant was ending war, or not funding war, or trying to end a violent conflict through negotiation and getting to another place. So it's negative peace in the sense that it's focused on violence and war, but it may not be focused on justice. You can end a conflict and still leave injustices in place. How many times has the conflict slowed down in Israel-Palestine? But the injustices remain in place, and they always come back. So that led to a second category that we often emphasized, and that was the idea of positive peace. And positive peace results when personal and collective actions lead to priorities and policies and outcomes that make our families, our neighborhoods, our cities, our states, our nation, and our world better, more just places. So one of the reasons I asked the question that I did about what other concerns you might have is I'm guessing that many of you are engaged in a variety of really, really important things that matter. You care about quality education. You care about our healthcare system that doesn't really function very well for huge numbers of people. I'm guessing you care about many, many things, and you're engaged in those. And that I applaud and say, way to go. Any of you who are, and I'm guessing many in this room are and have been, you are positive peacemakers by this definition. Now, the problem, and that's true, and I'm not going to ever take anything away from that. But the problem is that even in the discipline of peace studies that I taught in, the emphasis now has shifted almost entirely on positive peace. Now why do I think that that's not such a good idea? Well, the great thing about it is it allows us to link our work on behalf of the environment and climate change and climate refugees to peacemaking, right? That's terrific. But I just attended in Iowa a recent gathering of colleges and universities that in one way or another have peace studies programs or departments. There was no one, and I was there just observing. There was no presentation in the entire 2 days that dealt with militarism, with war, with Ukraine. Lots of stuff on the environment, lots of stuff on other things, and they're all really important. But if we're not talking about the elephant in the room, then our likelihood, and I'm going to say this many different ways, our likelihood of success in all of those positive peace areas that we're working are diminished, or all we can accomplish through those are diminished unless we address militarism and war. And particularly, as U.S. citizens, U.S. involvement. Now, here's where I want to make a distinction, and some of you have heard me make this before, and you may think I'm wordsmithing and that it's ridiculous, but I hope you'll listen to why I'm doing this and what I mean when I do it. I want to make a distinction between militarism and militarization. Okay? We use them interchangeably, and I sometimes do when I'm just talking. But they're really a little different. And so here's the difference that I want us to think about, particularly as religious people, as many of us are in this room. Militarism is a belief system, and it's a belief system in the usefulness of violence. It's a belief system that violence is a solution to many problems, that war can be a solution to many problems. And that belief system is really strong. One of my professors many, many years ago was Walter Wink, a name that might be familiar to some of you. He often talked about the nonviolence of Jesus and made a case for that some of the biblical passages were actually involved Jesus embodying a lot of the theory that we now see at the heart of justice and peace studies in terms of nonviolence. He would say the number one religion in the world is violence. It's not Islam, it's not Christianity, it's not Judaism, it's violence. Most people believe in violence. And I'll talk more about I want us thinking more about how that takes shape in this country. The flyovers, the cheap veneration of troops involved at any of you ever go to a Twins game or watch a Twins game on TV? Every single game, there's a cheap veneration of troops. And I say this, I know among some of you who are vets, and vets that I know and who respect what I do always say, it's great if you thank us for our sacrifices, because every soldier in every war has sacrificed. But don't thank us for our service. Don't thank us for our service, because so often that is just a cheap way of civilians saying, oh, thank you very much, but not paying attention to the wars we send people to fight and all of these related questions. Every major newspaper in the United States has strongly supported every war that this country has fought since World War II, no matter how disastrous. No matter how many flawed and failed war strategies the United States has engaged in the last number of decades, what institution has the highest rate of trust in the country? It's not teachers. It's not the clergy. It's the military. This idea of glorifying and creating a culture, if we don't pay attention to that, and I was talking to my wife about this earlier this morning, and she said, you know, I think a lot of the problem is that most of us are just blinded. Now, how many of you would respond positively when I say the U.S. is the most militarized country in the history of the world? Now, militarization, then, is the enactment of this belief system, the enactment of policies that flow out of the belief in violence. And you can trace many, many things to it. Our inflated military budgets, our desire. How many of us would, if we had the choice, spend the $1 trillion we're going to spend as a nation to upgrade our nuclear arsenal? How many of you would rather spend that on climate change? I'm hoping it's most of you. I don't know if you listened to President Biden's speech the other night, and if you did, you can ask me my feelings about it. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that one of his selling points for why we should support Ukraine is that we're giving them our older weapon systems and we're developing new, better ones. So militarization, then, is the living out of policies that reflect our belief in military violence. All right. Now, I should be, I'll wait here just a second. I want to acknowledge something that you all probably understand, but I should state it anyway because this is being taped, and who knows, it might be shown to other people who would say, well, wait a minute, Jack, that the United States is not alone in this belief system, in the usefulness of military violence and the distorted priorities that flow from it. Certainly we see it in Russia, in China, in India, in Turkey, in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, and in many, many other places. But there are reasons why it's a particularly big problem for us. And before I name those 4 reasons why I think the challenge for us to, in all that we do, link our concern to this other big elephant that we sometimes see as separate. We see militarization as somehow separate. War is separate. It's not separate from any other goal that you have that would improve the human condition or improve the nation or improve our communities. There are opportunity costs all along the way. So I'm going to talk about 4 reasons. But before I do that, I used to ask my students when we talked about climate, I used to tell them, okay, I'm going to give you four options or a description of 4 political approaches to climate change that I believe are kind of at the heart of our country right now. The first one is there are still those, including the former president and many others in that crowd, who say that it's a hoax. Climate change is a hoax. Okay, so that's one. I'm assuming most of you are not there. The second very common position, and this is also more common within, I don't know if they're central or fringe within the Republican Party, but they would say, well, yeah, maybe global warming is happening, but it has nothing to do with human conduct. It has nothing to do with the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, so that's the second one. I'm also guessing most of you are probably not there. The third one is where I think most of us are, and I'm going to add a fourth one, which is a little bit different. The third one says global warming is real, it's happening, climate change is an existential threat. We need to be acting really, really fast and soon and be serious about this. But it's also, there are great opportunities here. And our challenge is to get away from fossil fuels as fast as we can and move to clean energy sources. Now, I would raise my hand and say, I agree with that. How many of you would agree with that? That's a good thing. I agree with you. But it's not enough. And so this is why I lay out a fourth option. And I don't even know exactly how to live my life with integrity in light of this fourth option. So I'm not standing up here saying, I've got every answer you could ever want, and we're going to walk out of here, and we're going to all have this agenda, and we're going to take care of this problem. But the fourth one that I presented is that yes, it's very important that we transition away from dirty energy to clean energy. But the environmental crisis we face is much, much deeper than that. Now, climate change aggravates all kinds of other environmental problems. But one of the biggest problems I think we have, it's becoming a problem, is that we believe that all we need to do is come up with clean energy and we'll be able to go on living the way that we have. Wow. Nothing really very costly. We're just going to do it in a cleaner way. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I'll tell you my summary, because what this really impacts is our approach to economics and our idea about what the purpose of economics is. Because right now, every presumption of policymakers in this country is that the solution to most of our problems is not only clean energy, but growth. That we're going to grow our way out of the deficit crisis, we're going to grow our way out of poverty, we're going to grow our way. And meanwhile, we have an earth screaming back at us saying, no. So my one sentence, or maybe it'll be two, kind of summation of the implications for economics is I believe that the purpose of economics must be to provide the material foundation for meaning-based societies. That the world that we're headed to, if we're going to transition to an authentically sustainable world, is going to have to think about growth and what we produce and what needs we meet in very different ways. And not assume that just through growth we'll continue to be able to handle our other problems and things will trickle down. So I'm going to say that sentence one more time. The purpose of an economy needs to be to produce the material foundation, housing, food, clothing, transportation, healthcare. We can name many of the basic things that are just foundational to a meaningful life. And with that foundation, especially if it's widely shared, we remove a lot of the reasons for conflict. And we create a more peaceful and more sustainable world. Now that's a really, really big challenge. I acknowledge that. Okay, I'm just going to say a few more things and then open it up to you. I wanted to just highlight why I think addressing war and U.S. foreign policy in particular, and this idea of militarism as a belief system and the militarized policies that flow from it. Why is that message, although it's true in China, it's true in Russia, it's true in Turkey, it's true elsewhere, why is it particularly important for us as U.S. citizens to link our work on climate stuff or environmental stuff or educational reforms or healthcare, all those things? Why do we need to confront militarism? Well, the first is that I would argue, as I started to mention, that our culture is just so fully steeped in militarism, this belief system. I mean, again, we can talk about we can talk about my criticisms of the Biden speech if you want to hear that more. But as you all know, politics is a comparison, and compared to elsewhere, you know, I don't want to be too harsh in my critique of him. But it reminded me when he talks about the U.S. as the indispensable nation. That's the rhetoric of 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I heard one commentator on MSNBC after the talk that said, wow, that was a weird comparison to say you got Ukraine on the one hand, invaded by Russia, so we're defending them, and then you're looking at Israel, and he said, for most of the world, Israel is Putin in this situation. And for the U.S. to just fully identify with Israel, that may fly in the United States. But no, he said, no person in the third world right now would hear that speech and think, boy, they're right on target. Because in the experience of many other people, that's not the framing that makes sense to them, whether we like that or not. So the first point of why this is so important for us to name militarism as a kind of religion is because it's so central to our culture. How many ways do we glorify troops without really questioning, again, what we actually send them to do or want them to do, or the flawed foreign policies that we have put soldiers in just so many vulnerable positions? That culture is just really powerful. The second reason that it's so important for us, and again, what I'm asking here is maybe a fairly simple thing, but you're going to lose a lot of friends. That's maybe not your closest friends, but people that you hope would listen to you on other things. You may start losing. But I think that's a risk we have to take. And that is the United States, the second reason is that the U.S. is so unprecedentedly militarily powerful that we really do. What other country has 750 permanent military bases outside of our border? No one. No one has the capacity no country has the capacity to deliver the military violence. Now, I will say that our conduct and our pursuit of such things helps to fuel an international arms race. But at this moment in history, in terms of the capability of delivering violence, unfortunately, it's our nation that excels. And here's an aside, but I would say one of the big problems that the U.S. has is the same problem that Israel has. That both nations have assumed that supremacy militarily could lead to security. And it's not true. It just hasn't worked that way. All right, the third reason that I think that we need to really talk about militarism, this belief system, and then the policies that flow from it, are when you add that belief system to U.S. military power, and then you add the unprecedented capacity to inflict violence, and then you add American exceptionalism, then you've got real problems. So again, listening to Biden's speech, it was just steeped in American exceptionalism. And don't get me wrong, I am not standing here blaming every problem in the world on the United States. That's not what I'm doing. But we are U.S. citizens, and we are responsible for the policies of our country, responding to them, presenting alternatives, naming them, all those things. So that creates a kind of unparalleled, because if you really believe that you're an exceptional nation that stands above others, then you really don't have to abide by the rules, because you're exceptional. I remember, this is off track, but I remember reading a time when Secretary of State was then Hillary Clinton, and the U.S. was being forced to pull some of its troops out of Iraq. And so Hillary Clinton was on and said, I want to assure the world that although we're pulling these troops out of Iraq, we're going to position them throughout the Middle East so that there can be no outside interference. Really? Isn't that interesting? All right. And finally, and this is maybe my most important point, is just to emphasize that given present priorities, given that we spend more than $1 trillion each year in our budget on so-called security, those dollars add up. You know, go to the National Priorities Project website, and it'll give you all kinds of examples of what we could be doing if we weren't spending that money in the ways that we are. And if you share with me, some of you may remember, when I ran for Senate in 2007 and 8 for that 8 cycle, before I decided to run, I just opened a website and I reached out, and it was called The Most Important Decade. And I was arguing that the decisions that we would make in the next decade would carry over from then on. They would really be influential. And 2 of the main factors I was addressing was climate change and the wars. Those dangers have the dangers of ignoring what I was suggesting have not lessened. In the light of what's happening to the climate, they become more and more important. So my appeal to you at the end here is I want you to think about how we talk to others about our concerns. And I'm guessing that a lot of us have ties to networks of people. And those networks of people, most likely, most of the people that we know, are doing good things. They're doing good things with their money. They're doing good things with their lives. They're older like us, so we're not running to demonstrations all the time, but we're still engaged. So my challenge to us is that we find ways of bringing these concerns about war and the belief system of militarism into those conversations. Because if we do not, it's not that work becomes unimportant that we're doing apart from that. But again, the prospect, I'll just state it right out there, the prospect of actually doing what we need to do to prevent a climate absolute catastrophe is going to involve a shift that challenges military priorities in war. If we don't do this, it'd be like cutting one arm off and then, I don't know, trying to play a game where you need 2 arms. The last thing I'll say is, in the last election cycle, my wife and I decided that one of our priorities was going to be to flip the Minnesota Senate, because we had seen years in which the Senate, Minnesota Senate, would not take up any bills that mattered on every issue that we cared about. And so that could have been really depressing, or you could join with others, and I'm not taking credit for this other than I joined other people's efforts. But we just, this collective we, identified 5 or 6 key Senate races that if you won 3 or 4 of those, a lot of things could happen. And we had the most environmentally significant, and I would say social justice significant legislature maybe in Minnesota history, as a result of just, rather than getting completely discouraged about politics, being really smart. And so one of the things that, after listening to me, I don't want you to walk out completely depressed. I want you to walk out determined just to figure out other ways that you can continue with the work that you're doing, maybe deepen it in some ways, but just putting on it a conversation with the people who probably aren't thinking first and foremost about war and peace and military spending and the budget for nuclear weapons and all those things, that we include that in what we do. And I'll stop there. Yes?
Thank you, Jack, for your words of wisdom.
Why don't you wait for the mic, and then everybody will be able to hear.
Two things. I want to start with a statement and then a question. The statement is, we need the strongest military in the world to protect our interests, our national interests. And the question to that is, how does income inequality relate to our belief in militarism and the fact that we need this strong military to protect our interests?
Well, I think actually it's helpful that you're framing it in terms of protecting interests. And it reminds me of, I really appreciate the work of Andrew Bacevich, who has written a lot about how really the U.S. is not set up for national defense. It's set up for power projection in defense of interests. So I think you're right that U.S. military power sets out to maintain economic systems or economic access, all kinds of things. And that we would be, I mean, the U.S. military is engaged in climate change disrupting things in all kinds of ways. One of them is all the oil wars that we fought, or wars over oil. Another is the U.S. military is the single largest institutional user of fossil fuels in our nation and in the world. So, yes, we have to address interests. Now, in terms of inequality, I would say that a lot, I'll broaden this. From my vantage point, when I look at the Cold War, and I did this through the lens of living and working in Central America during the 1980s and early 1990s and spending a lot of time in that region, I would say the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War basically each used people throughout the so-called Third World as kind of international cannon fodder. Now, I will tell you, I'll say something about that a little bit more related to Ukraine. And so clearly, the economic system as it's now functioning has not addressed international inequality. And I would argue that's one of the reasons for internal inequality. Now, I've written a lot about this elsewhere, but equality really matters. Equality is associated with a reduction in violence, a reduction in the punitive prison systems, social well-being, life expectancy, lower infant mortality, everything that you can name in a positive direction is connected with greater equality. So U.S. foreign policy, I think you're suggesting, and I would agree. Now, I want to say one more thing, because I mentioned using the world as cannon fodder, and then both of those nations being willing to do it. I worry that that's a little bit about what the United States has decided to do in Ukraine. Now, obviously, the invasion by Putin is unjustifiable, although I think we should examine really every single Russian leader since Gorbachev warned that the expansion of NATO would be a disaster. And some U.S. foreign policies, like George Kennan said, expansion of NATO is going to be the biggest foreign policy disaster in the history of the United States. Well, we didn't listen to that, and we didn't listen to Russians' concerns. So it's not like we're completely off the hook here. But what I worry has happened now, and the shift took place so quickly. At first, it was about defending Ukraine against the aggression and helping them. But very quickly, it became about destabilizing Russia and the possibility of getting rid of Putin, degrading the Russian military. I see no end game within the present strategy of the United States and others. No end game other than an end game that might emerge way down the road, adding thousands and thousands of casualties along the way. So yeah, anyway, I worry that our policy, whether we're even aware of it, but I think our policy in Ukraine as it is right now is willing to sacrifice Ukrainians for a broader geopolitical objective of sending a message to China and weakening Russia.
As a fellow member of Veterans for Peace, I want to thank you for all your work you've done over the decades, first of all, Jack. Secondly, it's frightening as can be that we're now bringing carriers and whatever to the Mediterranean. We're bringing them near China. Scary times indeed. Underlying all of this, some of my cohorts would say capitalism is the real problem. Would you just talk about capitalism for a few minutes?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember which Native American writer it was, but it was years ago. They came out with an article, and basically it said, from their perspective, from a Native American perspective, there wasn't that much difference between capitalism and socialism or communism. It was just two approaches to who could best exploit the earth to turn it into things, right? So my critique of capitalism would also be a critique of some aspects of communism and Marxist societies and other things, that the ecological imperative the absence of an ecological imperative has infected all systems. But not to shy away from your question, I do think that the way that we have structured capitalism, particularly in our society, I mean, you have some forms of capitalism still in Sweden and Norway and those countries, but they do a much better job of having better social outcomes and much more equality than we have. So there are degrees to worry about. But the fundamental problem I have is this idea of unlimited growth. That it's just a matter of we'll figure out some way, some new resource, some new technology. And I'm not against technology, but what I'm against is if we keep doing things like that and kind of thinking we're progressing, we're making things worse ecologically still, and that growth imperative is ecologically not sustainable. So it's both, I think capitalism as it's now functioning, particularly in our country, fuels inequality and also fuels the ecological crisis and doesn't really offer us a way out.
Hello.
Hi.
How to frame this? I've read a couple of opinions that suggested that had Ukraine not voluntarily given up nuclear weapons in the 1990s via the Budapest Memorandum in return for a guarantee of sovereignty. And we, the US, the UK, and Russia agreed to guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty around the 1994 borders of that country, which now Putin has chipped away at by annexing Crimea and sort of trying to annex the Donbas region. Had they not given up their nuclear weapons, would Vladimir Putin have invaded? And so then, does the lesson become you better hang on to your lethal capacity so that you are not invaded by a tyrant like Putin, who is trying to reassert power in that region by re-annexing the Baltic states and he threatens his neighbors, the countries who managed to get out from under Russian rule since, in the Gorbachev and post region.
Yeah, that's a very good question. The first thing it made me think of, and I'll get directly to your question in a second, but was that was one of the lessons that a lot of nations in the world learned as a result of the U.S. and Iraq and other things, that Iraq would have been safer if it actually had nuclear weapons. And I would also point out that years ago, the Project for the New American Century, when they laid out exactly a year before the terrorist attack in the United States, they laid out this very clear, articulated plan for how the U.S. could permanently dominate the world. And it was by controlling the world's oil supplies, by regime changes in place like Iraq, through the militarization of space, a whole bunch of things. But specific to their plan was that the U.S. had to prevent any other nation from having nuclear weapons, so that and to put nuclear weapons in space. So, yes, I think an argument could be made that if Ukraine had them, maybe that would have been the deterrent. But on the other hand, that deterrent still does exist, because there are other nations that have nuclear weapons. It's not just Russia that has them now. But that is an interesting argument. What I would suggest, however, is that I can think of many scenarios under which Russia would have agreed if there had been agreements that said these states that used to be part of the Soviet Union agreed to be like Switzerland, essentially a non-aligned, non-militarized place. That probably actually might be one of the only solutions I see to the present crisis with Ukraine, is the U.S. now seems even more determined to expand NATO to include Ukraine. Whereas I think what the United States should be doing, instead of seeking to undermine efforts, we should be supporting all the efforts coming from India, Brazil, other countries, even China, to end this conflict, and to do that in a negotiated way that takes seriously at least what Putin says are his concerns, as well as the concerns of Ukraine. So I wouldn't dispute that maybe that's true. Maybe if they would have had nuclear weapons, but I'm not sure, because nuclear weapons are, in effect, unusable weapons, really. I'm not sure that that makes a lot of sense.
Hi, Jack.
Hi.
I'm Ruth Olson, and first question I have for you is, when I commend your work with helping to flip the Senate, because I was involved in that too with a lot of other people. And I'm just wondering if you were working with Isaiah on that, or Faith in Minnesota?
Well, certainly I was aware of the work that they were doing. I was more mobilizing within my own communities and targeting money donations and doing some door knocking and things like that, rather than, I wasn't a main institute. One of the things I figured out as an old white guy is it's way better for me to stay in the background, and that's much more appropriate than other things.
The other thing I wanted to mention, I'm reading the current issue of The Atlantic, and they have an in-depth interview written by Jeffrey Goldberg, who I respect very much, with General Milley, and where might we have been if he and his other military strength wasn't there to rein in that lunatic that's still around. So
yeah, no, it's you know, I'm 72 and I've been engaged in things for a long time, but I just shake my head in many ways at where we are. And not only do we have the existence of Donald Trump and what he tried to do, but the fact that wing of the party is not the wing anymore, it's the party. That's really pretty terrifying. And I would say, you know, when I didn't include that among my concerns that I shared today, but I think U.S., you know, one of the things I always thought was a little suspect was how the United States could declare itself the arsenal of democracy while supporting so many third world dictatorships. You know, so we've always had contradictions. And we've always had problems. We have structural problems in the way our whole electoral system is not the electoral system, but the government system that we have. You know, we give Utah the same amount of influence as California in the Senate. We have now a Supreme Court that is you know, wildly to the right. So our democracy is in bad shape. And I agree that it was really helpful that in this case, that general just said, we got to find ways to get around the madman, and did. Yes. Oh, right here. You're already. Go ahead, and then we'll go here.
I appreciate your comments to a previous question about the response to Ukraine and a way forward. That your proposed solution just makes a lot of sense to me as a way of avoiding the involvement of nuclear weapons and a less, you know, violent solution to the conflict there. What would you see as a way forward in the current Israeli-Hamas conflict, especially as it is right now at this very moment on the ground, to get to the point where we're getting to a ceasefire and then de-escalating and hopefully some sort of negotiated solution going forward?
No, it's a great question, and I'll try to answer it. I'm going to preface it with with 3 other comments, and then I'll get right to the heart of what you asked. The first is, if you read the article that I had in the Trib, I noted, you know, arriving in Israel-Palestine. So this people talk about Israel and Palestine as a conflict that goes, you know, way back in history. It really starts about in the 1890s and worsens along the way, and then after World War II, it really worsens. But this is not an impossible, religiously rooted conflict. It's a conflict over land injustice and marginalization and all those things. That's my first comment. Second comment was, I remember when I was running for the U.S. House seat, that was right when Hamas was elected. And the endorsing convention came down to whether Keith Ellison or I or Gail Dorfman would get the DFL party endorsement for that House seat that Martin Sabo dropped out of that race. And at the endorsing convention, there was actually a question about Israel, Palestine, and Hamas. And I went third in terms of, I just happened to be the sequence of how people answered. And, you know, quite frankly, Gail Dorfman and Keith they said almost nothing. Nothing really of substance, nothing controversial, nothing, I can't remember exactly what they said, but it wasn't what I said. And what I said was, if anyone thinks that starving Gaza in the aftermath of an election that no one was saying that Hamas stole the election. Hamas was elected. And in the context of the corruption of Fatah at the time. But I said, anybody who thinks that starving the Palestinians is going to be a solution, I think is kidding themselves. The shit hit the fan. I mean, it was unbelievable. And about half the people wanted to stone me, and about another half was just amazed that actually someone dared to say this in front of this crowd. And unfortunately, the U.S., from the very beginning, the policy was marginalize Hamas, further strangle the Palestinian people, and turn it into what Human Rights Watch calls an open-air prison. So that was 2006. Well, in the Senate race, where then it became whether it was going to be Al Franken or me. Eventually, that's what it got to. In all of the time of that campaign, not one question was ever allowed as part of any debate on Israel and the policy. So that's all a preface to saying what's happened there is obviously horrible. As I said in my op-ed piece, terrorism is awful, and it's awful for many reasons. You know, it targets relatively, innocent people. It takes attention away from actual grievances. It almost always results in a spiral of violence deepening in ways that hurt the people you are supposedly trying to defend through your act of terror. So having said all that, I think what the biggest responsibility that I feel is as U.S. citizens is we have to be pushing back against this idea of an unshakable, unambiguous, nothing that Israel can do is going to stop us from the framing that the U.S. has offered may sound really good to certain audiences, but I can tell you throughout the world, that made Biden's speech just completely incomprehensible to the most people in the world as a result of this unwavering support. Because I did see a really good article in the New York Times a week or so ago, and it was simply lawyers looking at international law. And they were very clear that the terrorist act of Hamas obviously violated international law and principles. But they went on to say that already, just even in the immediate aftermath, the Israelis were guilty of war crimes too. Now, so what the first step that will have to happen is the U.S. has always claimed to be a neutral broker, and we've been anything but. That we really need, I hope that you will do this too. Call Tina Smith and call Klobuchar and just say you don't want the United States associated with Israeli war crimes. That you condemn the Hamas attack, but you condemn also using the Palestinian people as reducing them to just revenge targets. And if we do that, at some point, I think the only way forward in the short term will have to be a ceasefire of some kind, right? An exchange of prisoners, those kind of things. And then I think we have to hope and encourage that this ground invasion, that happens before the ground invasion. Because if that ground invasion occurs and the U.S. is seen as an enabler to it, which we will be, I think that undermines any potential for the United States playing a meaningful role in what comes after.
I guess I'm kind of curious, going way back to the beginning of your presentation, just a curiosity. I work for the Minnesota Twins in guest services, so I've heard the national anthem a boatload of times, and I also seen where they always honor someone who served, and they always say, "I thank you for your service," and blah, blah, blah. And I'm also a person who likes to go back to the root of a problem. So would you say, if you had your choice, would you say the Twins should stop that part of it and just sing the national anthem or something?
I think what I would really like to see is I would like to see a variety of people now involved in the singing of the anthem and the raising of the flag, including the executive director of Women Against Military Madness and the head of Boy Scouts of America and the head, I mean, just a variety of civically engaged people from the community who are concerned about homelessness and poverty and hunger and justice and health care and all kinds of concerns that we have, honoring those organizations that are doing that work rather than this kind of single-minded reinforcement. And I think, maybe you can correct me on this, but I think the military actually goes to teams when it comes to things like flyovers and offers those kind of things to the baseball teams to do. And from their vantage point, they're very aware of the power of militarism that I've laid out. They're very important. They're very clear about the need to create a culture that is friendly to U.S. military goals and ambitions and things. So I would just say I don't mind, and I'd like to have someone from Vets for Peace do that and say, Vets for Peace today, U.S. veterans against the Iraq War, here they are, they're pulling, because that would communicate something very different than this daily just reminder. And boy, you could do something on Armistice, what used to be Armistice Day, and you could do something that would have a very different tone or message. So that's what I would say. It's just don't not say thank you, But I think right now it's performing a very different purpose than maybe even is intended. I don't know. I don't know what the twins are thinking. But it certainly is a lot safer for them to do what they're doing than it would be to expand the voices.
I've been to 4 protests this last week, and I'm amazed. I take my little Palestinian flag, and I'm amazed at all the young people walking by us, turn around and tell us thank you for being there. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that the Jewish people are not united
They're not
in
a
all
monolith.
of this.
Yeah.
The Zionists are on one side, and I don't know if the settlers are Zionists, but they're a big part of the problem. And for Netanyahu, and the Orthodox people don't even like the state of Israel. They're waiting for God to tell them where to live. And then our Reform Jews, Jeff Halpern and Rabbi Asherman, they don't like this either.
Right.
So, America is getting the wrong message, and I'm sorry for Biden continuing it. We got to cease fire.
Yeah. No, thank you. Those are really helpful comments, and it is a really great reminder to never say that there's a Jewish position on Israel, because it's much more complicated than that. Although I will say, overall, the news coverage has been pretty one-sided. And that's unfortunate, because it creates an image that says, now, of course, I would say certainly every Jewish person I know does not approve of Hamas's terrorist attack. I mean, that's a thing that we should all be able to unify around, and we do. But there are many, many Jewish voices that's why, in part, I got the response I did when I said what I did in 2006, is because we treat it, or I'll say it this way. I think many really good people are really afraid of being accused of being anti-Semitic. When I wrote the book, Jesus Against Christianity, that just pointed out how many violent images there are of God in the Hebrew Scriptures and Christian New Testament, I was accused of being anti-Semitic just for just for talking about what was in the text. But did that stop me from saying I think that's an important issue to talk about? No, it didn't. We do need to talk about those things. In a similar way, you're no friend of Israeli security if you throw the label anti-Semitic around when it really has nothing to do with anti-Semitism and it has to do with a criticism of policy. That's not a benefit to anyone, including to people who really care about Israeli security.
Aren't Palestinians Semites also? They're all cousins.
Yeah.
They're all cousins.
We have one more question, maybe? And then I'll put my mask on, but I'm happy to talk to a few people before I walk out of here, too, if you want.
Yeah, I'm John Schmidt, and I'm with Vets for Peace, and I've been involved in other justice issues, but is this on?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
I can hear you.
You know, it seems like our congressional elected people almost universally give the military more money than the, administration is asking for. And, I mean, there's so much, like, our congressional people, they all take, like, good amount of money, election campaign financing from military weapons manufacturers. And I guess your idea is that by speaking with our communities and, talking about the inequalities that militarism leads to, et cetera, and that eventually will take preeminence or over money from these military people as a result of Citizens United,
Yeah.
money is speech, whatever. Okay, so is that what you're foreseeing as going to be happening?
Yeah. What I would say to what you said, which was very helpful, is I think one of the very important talking points for people who want to see different priorities is exactly what John said, and that in recent budget cycles, the military is getting way more than even what the military asked for, which itself was insane, right? And that is a measure of the depth of what I'm talking about, is this belief system in the utility of violence. But it's also a confirmation of Eisenhower's big complaint about the military-industrial complex being able to distort national priorities because of its self-interest. Now, one of the things I didn't say earlier that I probably should be said is that I would say the principal, or maybe a very important reason for the expansion of NATO, but at the heart of the expansion of NATO was the lobbying of the military-industrial complex, because they have been the principal beneficiaries of that expansion. Almost all the weapon systems that go into the countries that we expand into NATO are from U.S. military suppliers. It's a huge driving factor. So last thing I'll say in relation to what John said is, part of our talking point is that none of us are in this room are opposed to national policies that help the nation be secure. But that's not the purpose of the U.S. military. It's not simply to keep us secure. It's the power projection that was talked about earlier. It's the expansion of weapons sales that are related to the expansion of NATO. So if we can get people thinking about authentic definitions of security, which by now must include taking care of the climate crisis and responding to it, that is a far graver threat. Okay, do you want me to leave you with one other profound challenge? The one book that I have thought about writing, although I've given up writing because I decided not very many people want to read what I write, is a book about men and violence. Men and violence. And as we look around these leadership around the world, if you look around who's at the table, it's not that women can't be violent. Of course, women. We got Margaret Thatcher and we got a lot of examples. But overwhelmingly, violence at every level of society, whether we're talking about in the home or determining military policy, are overwhelmingly driven by men. And I think somehow, some way, sometime, we have to be willing to name that as well, because it's very rarely talked about. All right, I'll leave you with that.
Thank you.